Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 71 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 4-2. So their loss streak is now extended to 6 games in a row. They've lost all 3 of their games against the Western Canada teams of Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver. And honestly, it's really not all that bad. Obviously, if the Sharks were still in the playoff race or a playoff spot or had any sort of hopes of making it to the postseason, this would be a death blow to those chances. But since the Sharks are already way out of it at this point, almost 20 points if I'm not mistaken, losing 6 games in a row, basically all it does is improve your draft chances. So while it obviously would be fun to see a win here or there from the San Jose Sharks to have something to be positive about in the moment, in the end, it basically is, you could say, for the greater good, so not necessarily the end of the world. Now, when it comes to how this game went down, we had a very interesting start to this one, and we have to start with this Vancouver goal from Dickinson to make it 1-0 Vancouver, but this goal only comes to be as I believe it was Kyle Burroughs who laid a pretty nasty hit onto Ryan Merkley, Sharks defenseman Ryan Merkley, and it kind of looked like a hit to the head. I never necessarily got to see a very great angle of the hit, but the ones that I did see from relatively far out did not look good, and at real time, it also did not look good. However, there was no penalty call called in the moment. The whistle wasn't even blown, although Ryan Merkley did remain down on the ice, and the Canucks, like I said, would go down the other way and score on the 2-on-1 for the 1-0 early lead. So, I mean, I could, feign the possibility of there being some sort of supplemental discipline in this situation for Kyle Burroughs of the Canucks. However, there are multiple factors going against that. For one, Ryan Merkley would return to the game, so there was no injury. For two, there was no actual penalty called on the play in the first place. And third of all, of course, that the Sharks very rarely get any players suspended against them, so why would that necessarily change the sort of pattern there? I found it very interesting that at the intermission, the panelists were discussing whether or not this was a late hit, because honestly, who cares whether it was a late hit or whether it was in the correct time window where a player can still be hit after getting rid of the puck. The major problem was this a hit to the head, and it really did seem to be the case. Merkley did have his head down a bit. Certainly, I wouldn't say that Kyle Burroughs had to go extremely out of his way by launching himself in the air to hit the head of Ryan Merkley, but this is still something that was very, very reckless, and I would feel like in a normal world he'd probably be given a couple of games for this, but like I said, it's likely not to happen, and it's kind of sad that I'm a bit jaded by just previous events that have happened against the Sharks that have not led to suspension either. Eventually, the Sharks would manage to tie the game. In fact, it was actually on a 5-on-3 power play. Tomas Hertl, his 28th of the season, to make it 1-1. Funnily enough, that despite this power play goal being scored by the Sharks, it was an absolutely disastrous game for the power play, and specifically that 5-on-3 was just really bad. They had issues entering the zone. They gave up a shorthanded chance to Tyler Myers in a 5-on-3, and not necessarily, a shot was blocked and so it's a shorthanded breakaway, but literally he was allowed to get down the ice. There's bunch of Sharks players around him. Nobody's able to take the puck from Tyler Myers of all players, and it was a lot of time killed off. So yes, the Sharks did end up getting that goal from Hertl, but it was not a good night for the Sharks power play, and in fact you could say it wasn't a good night for either team's power plays, as I believe the Sharks ended up with 7 minor penalties in this game, and the Canucks with 7 power plays, and did not manage to score in a single one. Into the second period, game still remained rather even. The Canucks would score the goal that would break the tie. Connor Garland would make it 2-1, but with just a couple minutes to go in the second period, Nick Bonino would score once again. He's been kind of on fire, I guess, as on fire as Nick Bonino can be as of late, and he makes it 2-2, and we head into the third period with a tie game. Thing is that obviously this is who's going to win the third period. The Sharks don't necessarily have a ton to play for. Like I mentioned, they're almost 20 points out of a playoff spot. Meanwhile, the Canucks, while they are kind of on the brink of being out of the playoff race, there is still hope there in Vancouver. They're only about about 6 points out, now only 4 points out with the victory here tonight. So they definitely had a lot more drive and a lot more push, something to actually look forward to if they managed to get the 2 points here tonight. And so they just looked like the better team in the third period. They would get the go-ahead goal once again from Alex Chason, and the Sharks would not manage to tie it up. There was a very nice sequence near the end of the game on the 6-on-5. The Sharks had a lot of zone time and a lot of pressure, but multiple shots were blocked, a couple of shots went wide, and eventually, even though there was a power play for the Sharks at the end, as Tyler Myers would get called for a pretty aggressive cross-check onto Logan Couture, eventually the Canucks would get the last-second empty netter from Schenn, and that would put the game away 4-2, like I mentioned. On to the players to talk about. We had a shakeup in the top 6. In the previous few games, I had talked a lot about the Meyer, Hurdle, Barabanov line, how it was leading the way, it was doing so well for the Sharks, but after that, it kind of just fell off, especially Couture not necessarily being given a ton to work with. Well, Bob Booner decided to make a pretty aggressive change here. Couture was kept with Chmelevski for tonight, but he was actually joined by Timo Meyer on his other wing side, and Hurdle was actually reunited with a line we saw earlier this season as he was placed with Balcers and Barabanov. Now, in the end, this first line actually looked pretty decent for the Sharks. Chmelevski, Couture, and Meyer. Meyer honestly kind of had a hit or miss game for me. He had some really, really great moments, but there were also some kind of awkward plays. He had a few missed passes early on in the first, though I would say in general it was a very strong game from Timo Meyer. And then when it comes to Couture and Chmelevski, not necessarily immensely impactful, but definitely still had a positive impact on the ice. When it comes to the second line, however, even though it was kind of 2/3 of that extremely successful line we saw previously, Hurdle and Barabanov, because Balcers is now replacing Timo Meyer, it essentially just completely fell off a cliff. Hurdle had a couple of nice individual plays in this game. He had a very nice pass that went flipping it in the air to try and break Balcers for a breakaway. Balcers did not really get much of a shot off at the end, and then Hurdle had maybe a very nice defensive play in the third period to break up a very, very good chance for the Canucks, but otherwise there really wasn't much doing here for this second line. Barabanov and Balcers both looked more or less invisible here tonight. And so the fact of the matter is that we saw Meyer playing with these two players, Hurdle and Barabanov, and making up a fantastic line. Suddenly Meyer is swapped up to the first line that wasn't doing particularly well, and now they looked quite strong. So it seems as though Meyer is kind of the player here on the San Jose Sharks, if we didn't already know that, considering Meyer has been the Sharks' best player thus far this season. It seems as though he is the main driving force on these lines, and right now the Sharks kind of need another winger who's able to do that. They just don't really have one on the roster at this point. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we had Gregor joining Bonino and Nieto as a replacement for Balcers, who of course was moved up to the second line, and this third line didn't do too bad. I would say the player who was replacing Balcers, Gregor, definitely had the most standout game of these three players. Gregor had about 3 very solid chances. I wouldn't say amazing grade A, but he had a couple of breaks. He used his speed, something that we honestly haven't been seeing a ton of from Noah Gregor. It felt as though earlier on in the season, around games 20, games 30, that Gregor would almost once a game get this great opportunity where he would have a breakaway or an almost breakaway, and then of course he wouldn't actually score because it was Noah Gregor. But then he kind of got away from that in the past couple dozen games, I would say, but here tonight he seemed to return to that form. He had a couple of great looks, didn't actually end up managing to score, but still gotta give credit to him. When it comes to the other two players, like I said, Bonino, I guess, stays on fire with this goal. A nice little simple tip play that goes through some traffic, gets past Thatcher Demko, and generally, while this third line wasn't anything impressive, it was okay enough. When it comes to the fourth line, probably where we had the most interesting lineup decision, not just of the game, but of the entire season, as Dahlen and Reedy were joined. Their third player on this line was none other than Radim Shemek. So Shemek had been looking to get back into the lineup over these past few games, but basically the Sharks have been just shuffling between Milosh and Merkley as the sixth defenseman in the lineup, and so Shemek never really had the opportunity. And so Bob Booner, in his infinite wisdom, thought of, well, VL isn't bringing anything offensive to the picture, and he's just kind of a physical body, so why don't we just play Shemek, who is, of course, a defender, but he's not going to bring anything offensive, but he'll be a physical body, and he can actually play a game. I mean, essentially, Shemek and VL aren't necessarily that much different of players. And so while Shemek didn't really do much offensively, though he did have one decent chance right off the bench in the third period, he did lay the body enough, and I'm sure that's exactly what Bob Booner was hoping to see out of him. Generally, compared to the past couple of games for this fourth line, it was actually a noted improvement. I thought Dahlin, while not amazing, had a better game than he has had in the past, especially when you consider his line mates have somehow managed to get worse from previously. I mean, now he's playing with a defenseman on his wing, or on his other opposite wing with Radim Shemek, and really okay game for himself, but still nothing blowing me away or anything like that. So it was an okay game for the fourth line, okay game for Dahlin. I honestly don't exactly know where it goes from here, what Shemek's sort of position is going to be at this point, but I guess we'll see. On the defensive side of things, once again, Brent Burns leading the way. I mean, I keep saying surprisingly at this point, but with it having been the case for the past few games, I don't know if it's a coincidence that the Sharks have lost all of these games, but Brent Burns continues to be pretty solid defensively. He didn't do a ton offensively. I wouldn't say he necessarily stood out in an amazing way, but he was probably still the Sharks' best defenseman here tonight. On the other hand, I got to talk about the Sharks' other top offensive guy, Erik Karlsson, who honestly did not stand out in an impressive or unimpressive way either, which is kind of strange because Karlsson frequently, night in, night out, will either make a very strong impression offensively where, wow, look at these amazing play he's making, or he'll make a very negative impression on the defensive side of things where, wow, he's just giving away pucks left and right like he's everything's on sale kind of thing. But here tonight, there honestly wasn't much coming from Karlsson. Relatively sound defensively, I would say, but also relatively sound offensively. There was a couple of plays, I guess, but nothing extremely impressive. So a pretty uncharacteristic, quiet game from Erik Karlsson. And finally, to the third pairing, of course, I mentioned earlier Ryan Merkley. He left the game for a brief moment after taking that big hit to the head from Dickinson, but apparently was cleared after that, would return near the end of the first period, about 15 or so minutes later, at least 15 or so minutes of the period later. And I kind of felt as though he never really found his footing after that in this game. I felt as though he was hesitating a bit too much, kind of found himself holding the puck a lot on multiple different plays, which kind of ended up in the situation where Vancouver Canucks players were converging on him very quickly, which forced him to make bad passes. And so I was not necessarily super impressed with Merkley's game, and especially when you consider the big hit that he did take, I wouldn't be surprised to see him once again for, the third, fourth straight game here seesawing as he comes pulled back out of the lineup, likely for Milosh. And finally, we have the goaltender Kähkönen gets the start. Not too much of a surprise considering Reimer, bit of a question mark just after the end of last game where he got injured. He had to come out and Kähkönen had to step in. Kähkönen had an okay game, made some nice saves, but there were also a couple of these goals he definitely could have had. The Garland one, he reads incorrectly. This is a situation where the Sharks, it's essentially a 2-on-1, but Ferraro is back-checking. I was a bit surprised to see Ferraro back-check and just kind of come in to try and block a pass that his other defensive partner was already trying to block. I thought Ferraro would come in and try to interfere with the shooter, which was Garland, but that doesn't end up happening. However, with now two defensemen looking to block this particular pass, Kähkönen needs to be like 99% committed to this shot opportunity from Garland, and for whatever reason, he's cheating to the other side, expecting a pass, and Garland is able to beat him on the short side, so not a great goal there. Look from Kähkönen, and generally also on the chase on one, I felt like he was making himself a bit too small in the net. The Dickinson one didn't necessarily have too much of a chance on, but while Kähkönen made some very nice saves in this game, he also let in a couple of weaker goals. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, and we will see if they can actually break out of this 6-game losing streak slump. Class dismissed.